This week we'll be talking about Unit 5, which deals with language and communication. If you've ever heard the phrase, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," you probably recognize, the same as I do, that is completely untrue. Language and words hurt and can uplift and are important to communication. So we'll talk about that today. So we'll begin our survey by looking at some of the features that characterize all languages. These features explain both why language is such a useful tool and why it can be so troublesome. Language is symbolic. Words are arbitrary symbols that have no meaning in and of themselves. So, for example, the word 5 is a kind of code that represents the number of fingers on your hand, only because we agree that it does. As Bateson and Jackson point out, there's nothing particularly 5-like in the number 5. The symbolic nature of communication allows us to communicate in ways that would otherwise be impossible. Now, the only reason that symbol-laden languages work at all is that people agree on how to use them. So we have different rules that we need to follow. We have phonological rules, which govern how sounds are combined to form words. For example, the words champagne and double have the same meanings in French and English, but their pronunciations differ across the two languages because of phonological rules. In French, champagne is champagne and double is double. Syntax is grammar, and they govern the meaning of words as opposed to its structure, the meaning of language in structure. So, for example, syntactic rules are broken with the language of Yoda. If you think about him, he says, "The dark side are they, your father he is." And that is a broken syntactic rules. Semantic rules govern the meaning of language as opposed to its structure. So semantic rules help us understand the meaning of individual words and what it is exactly that they mean. Pragmatic rules tell us what uses and interpretations of a message are appropriate in a given context. For example, all capital letters in the online context means that you're shouting. Language is subjective. That means that it's open to interpretation quite often, and meanings are in people, not necessarily the words. Language affects your worldview. Linguistic relativism, or linguistic relativity, explains that a language both reflects and shapes the worldview of those who use it. For example, bilingual speakers seem to think differently when they change languages. The best known type of linguistic relativity is known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This has been credited to Benjamin Whorf, a linguist, and Edward Sapir, who was an anthropologist. They studied the Hopi Indian language and found that these Native Americans represented a view of reality that's dramatically different from how speakers of other languages view the world. Why? Because the Hopi language makes no distinction between nouns and verbs. Thus, the people who speak it describe the entire world as being in process, moving, if you will. Whereas in English, we have nouns, subjects, verbs, and so we see things in terms of more like snapshots than a motion picture. As linguistic relativity suggests, language can have a strong influence on our perceptions and how we regard one another. For example, naming an identity. Research has demonstrated that names are more than just a simple means of identification. They shape the way others think of us, the way we view ourselves, and the way that we act. Additionally, an impressive body of research shows how language can build and demonstrate solidarity with other people. Convergence is the process of adapting one's speech style to match those of others with whom you want to identify. Divergence would be speaking in a way that emphasizes differences. For example, members of an ethnic group might use their own dialect as a way of showing solidarity with one another. Power and politeness. Communication researchers have identified a number of language patterns that communicate more or less power. Notice the difference between these two statements from an employee to a manager. Excuse me, sir. I hate to say this, but I guess I won't be able to finish my project on time. I had a personal emergency and, well, I just can't do it. Is it possible to have it to you on Monday? As opposed to, I won't be able to finish the project on time. I had a personal emergency and it was impossible to finish it today. I'll have it to you on thing on Monday. The first statement is an example of what's been called powerless language, whereas the second one is more powerful language. Hedges, disclaimers, beating around the bush, all go into taking power away from language. Sexism and racism. Sexist language includes words and phrases and expressions that unnecessarily differentiate between females and males, or exclude, trivialize, or diminish either sex. Additionally, racist language reflects a worldview that classifies members of one racial group as superior and others as inferior. And you can see, if you look at your textbook, it's got examples of both, how it tends to be baked into our language, which can be pretty troubling if you think about it. Most people assume that the goal of language is to make our ideas clear to one another. When clarity is the goal, we need language skills to make our ideas understandable to others. Sometimes, however, we want to be less than perfectly clear. So in the following cases or examples, we'll point out some types where vagueness serves useful purposes, as well as cases where complete understanding is the goal. So ambiguous language consists of words and phrases that have more than one commonly accepted definition. For example, the word love can mean a number of different things to different people. Abstractions are convenient ways of generalizing about similarities between objects, people, ideas, or events. High-level abstractions help communicators find face-saving ways to avoid confrontations and embarrassment, whereas low-level abstractions are much more direct. Euphemisms are innocuous terms that are substituted for blunt ones. A euphemism avoids a direct literal reference to an event, such as she died. We might substitute terms like, she's no longer with us, she took her last breath, she went on to a better place. Relative language gains meaning by comparison. For example, do you attend a large or a small school? Well, that depends on what you compare it to. Alongside a campus such as Ohio State with more than 60,000 students, your school might look small, such as compared with a college of 1,500 students. It would look pretty large. So relative words such as fast and slow, near and far, short and long are only clearly defined through comparison. Besides providing a way to make the context of a message clear or obscure, language reflects the speaker's willingness to take responsibility for his or her beliefs, feelings, and actions. So, for example, we have it statements. Notice the difference between the sentences in each set. It's worrying when you're late, or I'm worried when you're late. It's a problem, or I see it as a problem. But statements a lot of times have the effect of canceling the thought that precedes it. You're a really great person, but I think we ought to stop seeing each other. I, you, and we language helps us to take responsibility for a message. So we'll talk about that next. I language is a way of accepting responsibility for a message. You language, by contrast, expresses a judgment of the other person. Positive judgments, you did a great job, rarely cause problems. But notice how a you statement implies that the subject of the complaint is doing something wrong. You left this place a mess, you didn't keep your promise, you're really crude sometimes. You language is likely to arouse defensiveness. It implies that the speaker is qualified to judge the target. Not an idea most listeners are willing to accept. So the I message engages in assertiveness. Assertive messages are composed of 3 different types of I statements. One describes the other person's behavior, one describes your feelings, and the final describes the consequences the other's behavior has for you. So, for example, I get embarrassed that's the feeling statement. When I hear you talk about my poor grades in front of our friends, that's the behavior statement. I'm afraid they'll think I'm stupid, the possible consequence. We language implies that the issue is a concern and responsibility of both the speaker and receiver of a message. For example, we have a problem. We can't seem to talk about money without fighting. We language can help build a constructive climate. It suggests a kind of we're in this together orientation, which is known as verbal immediacy. This concludes our virtual lecture on Unit 5 and language. Have a good week, everyone.